Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Our guest today is Palo Alto City Council member Adrian Fine. Welcome to the show, Adrian.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, Adrian, I'd like to give our viewers a chance to learn a little bit about you, kind of the Adrian before you became a council member. Where are you from, and where did you grow up, and what was that experience?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Palo Alto. I'm the youngest of 6 kids. And when I was growing up in Palo Alto, it was a wonderful place to live, to bike around, to go to school, to eventually get a job. And my first job out of college was actually in government, working for the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. So I became pretty interested in kind of how buses move, how we fund our transportation system, how we plan our land uses. And so I went back to grad school for city planning, and I came back to Palo Alto, and then it started circulating, and people were asking me like, oh, you should get more involved in this stuff. And one day I saw in the Palo Alto Weekly an ad to join the Planning Commission. I applied and was appointed. And that's how I got myself into Palo Alto politics.
Wow, started at the Planning Commission. That's interesting. So in that time, growing up in Palo Alto, in the time frame that you did, it seems like there would have been a lot of transformation. What sort of changes did you note from the time when you were growing up and biking around Palo Alto until the time you became a planning commissioner?
Sure. So I think the main thing is that, you know, in the span of 10 or 15 years, Palo Alto really did become this like global center of innovation and technology, and it really started to take off. I mean, Facebook was down the street from my parents' house, and then it was downtown, and then they were moving out to, you know, Menlo Park and things. And we had many other startups come, you know, grow big and leave. Associated with that was a lot of office growth, which I think has caused some of our problems today in terms of traffic, but also skyrocketing housing prices, which are a feature across the whole Bay Area. And then something else that I began to notice is I thought Palo Alto was like kind of losing a bit of its mojo, is the word I use, where we lost a lot of our local businesses. You know, we lost kind of our flair. Our streets kind of became less interesting, and it just disappointed me that we were kind of like slowing down. I saw other peninsula communities and South Bay cities being cooler, and that disappointed me as a Palo Alton.
Well, that's interesting because naively one might think that having a bunch of young people and tech innovators and their investors come and live in the community would sort of jazz things up. But that just sounds like that's not the experience that you have.
So I mean, I think the issue there is that they don't live in Palo Alto.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That we have students at Stanford, but they don't come to downtown Palo Alto anymore. And we have many folks who are innovating and building companies in Palo Alto, but they drive there and they go home at night.
I see.
And so the community in many ways is aging quickly. It's people like my parents who have lived in Palo Alto, worked hard, saved a lot for their home, and now are kind of aging in place. But there's a question of, you know, where does the next generation live?
I see. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Did you have a history of like public service in your family, or did you come to it on your own through your interest in transit and planning?
I mean, my parents were political. Both my parents came from South Africa in the 70s, and they were, you know, ticked off at the apartheid government and protesting and getting their heads bashed in.
I imagine everybody was political in South Africa in the 1970s.
And they left that country thinking it would end in a bloodbath. But they came to America. They made their fortunes here, you know, in technology and things like that. But we weren't terribly political. You know, I went to city council a few times as a kid to speak on some small items. But no, not really. I mean, I just, you know, applied to the Planning Commission because I wanted to work on planning and transportation issues, keep my planning skills up to snuff, and help out my community. It sounds like
you were well qualified for that. Do you remember anything that you? Now, most kids don't go to city council meetings and say anything, even in Palo Alto. Do you remember any one thing that you went down there for? Was it school related or community related?
There was something school related about flood protection and like the levees in the Baylands and like the old marina at the Boy Scout. Launching pads there, just something involved with our schools and like sea level rise stuff.
Well, so fast forwarding to your role as a city council member, I do want to talk to you about policy a little bit later in the program. But when you see people, like young people, come to council now, do you remember your own experiences? What's that like from the other side of the dice? Yeah, no, I mean, it's always interesting. You know, you often get, you know, somebody coming up to you afterwards like, oh, I'm so glad I spoke, but I was so nervous and I did terribly. And it's important for me, at least in the role I have, to reassure folks, you know, young, old, first time, you know, veteran speakers that, you know, hey, please, like, show up, speak up, like your voice needs to be heard. I think in the Bay Area, that's particularly true of young people. Many of our council meetings do skew to a certain, you know, demographic. And so at least up on the dais, I think we have an important role of kind of
indexing the different groups and figuring out like who is here tonight speaking and who is missing. What voice are we not hearing actually?
Right. Well, that's a great insight, because I think that's probably one of the hardest things to do is to not be led by the voices that you are hearing and realize that there are some folks who might not be represented. So, in your experience on the MTC, what things stood out to you? It sounds like that really spawned a continuing interest in government and planning. What sort of things really stood out?
Sure. So first of all, I was really impressed that I'd never worked for government or knew much about it, but I was really impressed with the caliber of the people. That MTC kind of operates like a corporation. It was also just stunning to see the range of where funding comes from, how it's arrayed from the state or the feds or local governments to go into certain projects in different communities. The control that MTC and Caltrain have over things like our highways, our bridges, our tolling, all that kind of stuff. And just how you align these different pieces to actually get people around and support our economy. It's also related to all the environmental stuff, whether it's emissions or land uses, and it just really struck my interest.
Yeah, that's interesting. So planning and land use are kind of a complicated set of issues, and one thing, the MTC is interesting because its jurisdiction spans kind of municipal jurisdictions, and with housing and transportation, and land use generally, it seems one of the challenges we have in the Bay Area is the lack of comprehensive and effective ways to do regional planning and organization. Is there anything in the MTC model that you think might apply in other areas and be helpful?
So there's a few things that are interesting. I think you do touch on the main point that land use control and a lot of transportation controls at the local level,
right.
But there's 100 cities in the Bay Area, and you and I can't tell the border between Mountain View, Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, Los Gatos. These are cities that just have grown together.
Right.
There are a few things that are kind of interesting from MTC's perspective and some of the other regional bodies. So first of all, some of the money from groups like MTC and the Air Quality Management District are now increasingly being used to support regional problem solving in terms of transportation especially. MTC has their new group called CASA, the Committee to House the Bay Area, which is looking at how do we kind of balance across jurisdictions this need for multiple places to do housing instead of one city sitting on its hands and saying, well, someone else is going to build the housing for us.
Right. How do you feel about that? Is that an avenue for communication? Or obviously it's not something that would have the teeth of being able to make planning decisions or overrule or impose any obligations.
Well, I think given the depth of the housing crisis and how little action many cities are taking, I think we absolutely do have to question the value of local control and what our zoning laws are getting us. In Palo Alto last year, we produced, I think it was 80 housing units are permitted. The year before was 16. Our goals and all our plans show we should be doing much, much more than that.
Right.
And so our zoning isn't getting us the outcomes that we plan for.
Yes.
And I think that's something we need to address.
I remember frustration in my own early activism being involved in the housing element in my then hometown of Mountain View, and realizing, having done work with a lot of activists to try to make a strong movement on affordable housing, that all of the numbers were the same numbers from the housing element 5 or 7 or however many more years ago it was. It was that we were just promising emptily to build the same units that hadn't been built under the previous plan, and I think that was some time ago, and the problem's only gotten worse since then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so there's this regional housing needs allocation process,
right,
where we say we need a plan for this much, but each cycle we say like, oh gosh, we only got to 30%,
right,
and then we throw that whole thing out and we start over,
right,
but we don't allow it to accumulate, and so like,
yes,
there's a growing gap that we're not accounting for.
Right.
And there's still, people moving here for jobs and
yes,
people having children, and those folks need homes too.
Yes, it's amazing because I think in most parts of the world, an economy that's growing and creating jobs would be a helpful thing. I saw the April jobs report showed that almost 40,000 new jobs were created in California, 7,000 in Santa Clara County, and we, as you know very well as a council member and an observer, that the housing doesn't exist for those families and those jobs. Transportation is an interesting thing, public transportation. And America's always been a little bit, except for certain cities like New York, has always been a little shy of relying much on public transportation. And I know Santa Clara County is a very large county geographically. It has remote rural areas. It has mountainous regions that don't have that many people that need to be reached. And then it has sort of the north end of the county, which is sort of the heart, like Palo Alto, your community of Palo Alto, the heart of a very populated peninsula. And do you think that public transportation is reaching Palo Alto, for example, in an effective way? Are there any ideas that you would have about how we might do that better if we were the masters of the universe?
Short answer is no. I think for a few reasons. One, I think you're right, the county is many different places and types of cities and communities. And so it's actually just hard conceptually to solve that transportation issue.
Right.
The second issue is Palo Alto, being at the north end of the county, I think has this perception, and I somewhat agree with it, that we're not quite as well served by VTA as we should be.
Right.
And so, if you go downtown Palo Alto, you see just as many Samtrans buses as you do VTA.
Right.
We don't have the light rail, right?
Right.
And that may not be perfectly applicable to us. So there's a lot of issues. And then also, with us, we have essentially a 3-to-1 jobs to housing ratio. So all those people are driving in most days.
Right.
We absolutely rely on Caltrain. I think Palo Alto Station is the second highest in line after San Francisco. So that's really our backbone, which is being improved right now, but also poses challenges in terms of grade separations and things like that.
Now, Caltrain's an interesting creature because I think that the system was created at a time when places like Mountain View and Los Altos, or maybe even Palo Alto, and certainly places further up the peninsula, were sort of bedroom communities for people who had jobs maybe in San Francisco. And it's a narrow peninsula, so I suppose that having the thoroughfare there is good. But maybe there'd be chances to change that service in a way that addresses the current situation, where, as you said, there are many jobs in Palo Alto and not as much housing to match them.
Well, I think there's a few things to look at there. One is, first of all, we need to find some dedicated funding for Caltrain, because right now it's just funded by fiat by the communities that use it.
Right.
The other side of it is, I know San Jose now down south is really pushing for more jobs.
Right.
And some people in Palo Alto are happy with that, and I think there is a balancing act to go on there. But we also have to realize that new jobs and development do increase our tax base and our ability to pay for services that residents love.
Right.
So there's a balance there too.
That is always a balance. So the jobs versus housing balance, it's an interesting thing. And San Jose's, flip side version of that issue is, well, we have housing, but we need more jobs. And I don't think it's so much that they need jobs, because of course people living there have jobs in the current rate of employment in the area generally. But it's really a question of having jobs be closer to where people live. And so I think they're going through their own process of trying to decide, well, do we build more housing in the heart of our town and try to get more jobs down there, or do we build the housing elsewhere? It's kind of their issue and concern.
No, I mean, San Jose has those constraints. Palo Alto's a little different. We are a community that is built out horizontally.
Right.
We've preserved the baylands and the foothills, and we're not going to do anything there.
Right.
So now we're facing essentially the challenge of infill, and how do we update our downtown and our California Avenue, our second downtown, El Camino Real, one of our commercial corridors. And I think kind of that transition from these like suburban bedroom communities to these mid-urban places, is tough. It's politically tough. It's conceptually tough.
Right.
And in terms of figuring out what the community wants and how to bring them along, and where we're going is actually a tough story to weave.
Fabulous. Well, it's been interesting in this segment. In the next segment, we'll talk a little bit more about those tough decisions, as I know you've been in the center of many of them and have your ideas about them. So I'll look forward to having that further discussion with you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian.
Hi, my name is Steve Preminger. I'm a longtime Democratic Party and community activist. Donald Trump is our president. I know that doesn't sound good, but it's true. This is the time for all Democrats and other people in our community to come together to form an alliance like we haven't seen here in Santa Clara County. We don't know what's going to come down from the Trump administration. Based on his campaigns, it can't be good. The local Democratic Party is the antidote. They're developing an alliance of community and other activists, and they need you to join. Give them a call at 408-445-9500.
We're back with Palo Alto City Council member Adrian Fine. Adrian, before our break, we just started talking about tough decisions and housing. One thing that has come up recently and in recent months is action at the state level to address housing. And from the perspective of a council member, I'm just curious as to as to what your take on some of these initiatives has been. Some of the examples have been trying to streamline the process for certain kinds of development decisions. What some have thought was the most extreme approach has been proposed recently is Senate Bill 827 by Senator Wiener, which would have given a density bonus to certain kinds of development in transit areas. And as you know, recently it was it didn't make it out of committee, but it certainly seems to have started a conversation about the balance between the need to build housing and local control, which for reasons that as a council member you know well is important to communities.
So I think I'll just say as a young person, I'm very enthused that the state legislature is beginning to take this issue on, because I think many of our local councils and municipalities have frankly failed at it. You know, statewide we're looking at a gap of 3 to 4 million homes, and that's growing every single year. There's some pretty amazing figures about how much this housing crisis is hurting our economy. We all know friends and family, longtime renters, and even owners who are leaving the state. And I think we're really at a turning point where the state is beginning to step in because they have to. And we're asking ourselves, is this the society we want to be? Is this all we can be? So on some of those bills, I was one of the few elected officials who supported Senate Bill 827. And for me, it comes from my perspective as a city planner and as a city council member, that the bill was essentially saying cities cannot stop apartment buildings near transit. And when we think about the size of this crisis and what we need to do it, the main solution, the 90% solution, is more housing. And we can absolutely talk about affordable housing and the inclusionary requirements there that many cities, including Palo Alto, have. But we need to start from a point of we need to build more housing. And the best place to do it is near transit. And 827 really put its thumb on the scale in that direction. And although it failed, I was disappointed. I think you're right. It started a new conversation about what's the balance between zoning controls. Are cities using these controls for the general safety and welfare? So
I guess that to that point, in your experience as a council member in making these land use decisions, what's the dynamic that you've observed? Because if it seems like a developer would be wise to come to a city like Palo Alto and say, "Hey, I want to take this kind of underused building and convert it into a lot of housing over retail," it seems like the developers would have that motivation, and that the city would be very open to that. Isn't that not always the dynamic?
So there's two ways I think about this. So one is from the very start, at least in Palo Alto, many other cities, we put our foot on housing from the start of the race. And so we kind of have this housing last priority. It's like, we want housing, but the parking. We want housing, but the setbacks. We want housing, but the ingress and egress. We want housing, except how it looks. We want housing, except that. And so there's so many buts that eventually we kill these things by 1,000 cuts. I see. And so we have one project coming through Palo Alto right now. It's in a VTA parking lot. It's at one of our major intersections. It's smaller units. I think about 15 or 20% of them are affordable. This is the kind of project we say we want to see, but as it goes through our different planning commissions and architectural review boards and comes to the city council, it keeps on getting smaller and smaller and less feasible. And so we're really coming at this thing of saying, our priorities, and housing is kind of the last priority we have. The other way I think about it is oftentimes, if you walk around downtown Palo Alto, you'll see some of these wonderful old apartment buildings, which would be illegal to construct today. And so we have these buildings that are 4 or 5.
Illegal because they're too small or too big, or?
They break the density limits, they break the height limits, they don't have enough setbacks, they don't have enough parking. Wow. But these are like 4 or 5 story apartment buildings, near a train station. They're wonderful construction, and as they're older stock, they actually tend to be more affordable. And you could not rebuild those buildings today. And so, Palo Alto downzoned in the 1970s. We redid our comprehensive plan, and we made it much harder to produce housing, and we're living with the effects of that today.
Now, Palo Alto strikes me as a place, in fact, it's been a birthplace of some significant local environmental movements. You've mentioned the protection of open space, and it seems like that's a value that even today Palo Alto residents would articulate and say that they support. But is it the case that do members of the community understand the relationship between housing and the environment in terms of pushing sprawl out and having people in cars trying to drive to the city to these jobs?
I think many people do. The fact that if we don't build in Palo Alto or San Jose or San Francisco, somebody's going to build out in Tracy or Modesto and just drive here. Right. So I think people do get that. I think that kind of connection is really hard to think about, though, when you're looking at the project down the street from your house.
Right.
So that's tough. And that actually kind of speaks to the problem is, we have this societal community problem across multiple cities, but we're really focused on like the block by block level or this building.
Yes.
And so that kind of telescoping can be difficult.
Right. Well, that might bring us back to SB 827, because I know that one thing I've observed is that some of the hardest land use decisions have come in border transition areas, Santa Clara to San Jose or Sunnyvale to San Jose. And the communities, quite frankly, can get into kind of nasty fights about that. It's like, we don't want you to build that housing and that big development next to our border, because then our single-family home neighborhood adjacent will have traffic that we don't want, or parking that we think would be problematic. And it gets back to that problem or challenge of regional planning, I think.
Right. But it's, we're kind of caught in a trap a little bit. In Palo Alto, we recently passed or made permanent an office cap. So we said, we want to limit office growth to 50,000 square feet per year in our downtowns. At the exact same time, Facebook in Menlo Park is looking at millions of square feet. Google in Mountain View is looking at millions of square feet. And Palo Alto right in between. And I'll tell you, the folks driving to there are going to drive through Palo Alto.
Right.
It's like, does our office cap really matter? I'm not sure.
Right. So a regional vision might be necessary really to address that. Well, that's interesting. So what are specifically hard decisions that you've had to make on the council? One thing you haven't mentioned is the in some communities, it's the case that people generally want more housing or accept that there needs to be more housing, and it's really the specific development. I guess you did just allude to that. It's the one that's sort of in your neighborhood. It's like, well, I want, but not right there where I have to see it, or it's going to cast its four-story shadow on my rose garden. Have you had much of that, where within the community people have wanted housing or said that they want housing, but really not that near them?
So an interesting one has been the accessory dwelling units, or granny flats in the backyard.
Yes.
We did respond to state law last year and updated our laws to make it easier to produce accessory units in Palo Alto, and we've seen a few more come in. I think that was an interesting one because it's essentially empowering individual voters or property owners to make their decision. Right. Do I want to allow housing in my backyard or not?
Right.
So I think that was kind of a helpful discussion. In Palo Alto, we recently passed an affordable housing overlay, which makes it a lot easier and more feasible for affordable housing developers to create 100% affordable projects in certain areas in the city.
I see.
And then I was the lead.
How does that work exactly, Adrian? Is it that they would be able to make a more dense project as long as it's all affordable?
Yes. So if you're making a 100% affordable project, so deed restricted, income restricted, we're going to give you some extra square footage. We're going to reduce the parking requirements to a level that is documented versus what we've previously required. We can reduce setbacks a little bit and things like that. So we're allowing you essentially to build a somewhat larger, denser building on the same parcel. And we're saying we are giving you that flexibility because we want the public good of affordable housing. I was the lead author on a colleague's memo that passed unanimously last year, which is looking at simply increasing housing densities and heights and loosening some restrictions in our downtown core. And that's just saying, downtown Palo Alto, it's 1 or 2 stories. Can we maybe figure out a way to get a story or 2 of housing on top of these commercial buildings?
See, the accessory dwelling units are interesting for communities like Palo Alto and Los Altos, where I live, because there are a lot of people aging in place, and it seems like it provides an opportunity to make a little cottage for yourself on your property and rent your main home out as a source of income.
Right.
And may be able to be something of a solution.
Right, and I'll say, I graduated Gun High School with about 400 other kids.
Yes.
There's only a half dozen of us left in Palo Alto.
Right.
And the majority of them are now looking at ADUs in their parents' backyard.
Very.
And so.
Well, there are generational differences, and maybe we just talk a couple minutes about that, because I would say that Gun High School is a fabulous school and high-performing school, and everyone's proud of it in the community. And I would think that people would think it's something of a tragedy that people from your graduating class aren't back in the community and carrying it forward. And it really is, I'm sure, affordability of housing. That's the main explanatory factor. So there do seem to be generational differences in outlook and attitudes toward housing. The YIMBY movement here in the Bay Area, I find that many of the activists are young people, like yourself, who just see that it's been a failure for a long time to build housing. Senator Wiener, I think, speaks about it this way, quite compellingly pointing out that the number of units that we're behind now, it's just not a number that the normal planning process in every community throughout the state is going to catch up on. Right. And do you see opportunities or ways to to bridge those generational differences? Have you seen opportunities to do that on council? Because it seems that for the whole community and the whole state to have a consensus that it will be necessary not just for the young generation to realize that we're at a crisis point and a tipping point, but for others too as well.
So I guess for me, the first thing is to kind of paint that portrait to show like, hey, in California, we're millions of housing units behind. It's beginning to hurt our economy. The other argument I make is it's really actually impacting the quality of life of people who live here.
Right.
So whether you are a young person looking for a home or a rental, and that's hard, it's impacting your quality of life. If you are a family person and you are sending your kid to daycare, you are paying $3,000 a month for daycare because the person is coming in from far away. If you are retiring in place and you go to one of our hospitals, you'll see that they have staffing shortages in nursing. Your dentist cannot hire a hygienist. And so I think we are getting to a point where everyone's quality of life is being affected by this housing crisis, and that's kind of an intergenerational thing. The other thing is, we do have to figure out intelligent ways to build that new housing supply, affordable and market rate, while also respecting our existing neighborhoods. And that's a balancing act. At least for me, I think we do have enough opportunities for infill development in the Bay Area that we should be focusing on housing near jobs, near transit, near our bus lines, trains, all that kind of stuff. But that in itself is a tough fight.
Well, I'm sure that your position on City Council will give you opportunities to continue to have that conversation. If viewers were to want to reach out to you about housing or other issues that we've talked about today, what would be the best way for them to do that, Adrian?
So you can go to my Facebook page, which is pretty easy to find, or just email me at Adrian Fine, ADRIANFINE, @gmail.com.
Very good. Wonderful. Well, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you for the work that you're doing on council. I'm sure that you'll be able to move these housing issues and others forward bit by bit. Are you finding it to be more of a slog than you expected it to be, or pretty much what you thought?
I think conceptually it's what I thought. The politics of it are new and different, and it is a slog at times. But I enjoy it. I enjoy going out and working with community members, nonprofit groups, housing activists, and community members who are concerned about how their city's changing. I enjoy serving and always remaking these connections with people I've known for a long time or just met recently. So I do enjoy it. But
well, thank you for your work, and I think that your connection to the community, having grown up in it, I'm sure is a helpful dynamic and a helpful part of what you bring to the council.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for watching DTV. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website at www.sccdp.org. Help us to make a difference. We'll see you on the campaign trail.